The office was empty, save for the low hum of the air conditioner and the dim glow of the hallway lights filtering into my workspace. It was well past office hours, the time when most of the building's occupants had already packed up, leaving only those with unyielding deadlines or unspoken responsibilities. I glanced at the clock, and as it struck 9 p.m. I wondered if I was the only one left in the building. That was until I heard a faint sound, a soft rustling down the hall. I peered over my cubicle wall, catching a glimpse of movement through the window of the corner office. Mr. Calloway, my 64-year-old boss and CEO of the company, was still here. It was unusual, though not entirely surprising. Known for his diligence and exacting standards, he often worked late, his attention to detail and persistence setting him apart from other executives I'd worked under. Tonight, however, something felt different, though I couldn't quite place what. He was a formidable figure in our industry, respected, accomplished, with decades of experience. Even though he was nearing what some might consider retirement age, Mr. Calloway seemed indefatigable, running the company with the same energy and precision he must have had at the start of his career. His presence carried an intensity that I found both inspiring and occasionally intimidating, but over the months working as his assistant, I'd come to notice moments of kindness and humor beneath his stern exterior, moments that made me wonder who he was outside the polished professionalism. I'd long admired him from a distance, aware of the clear boundaries that separated us, yet unable to ignore a certain pull toward him. Perhaps it was his deep voice, measured and thoughtful in meetings, or the way his gaze would sometimes linger when he thought I wasn't looking. Small things that left me wondering if he noticed me in return. Just then he stepped out of his office, his familiar gait slow and measured. Seeing him, I reflexively straightened, as if he might catch me daydreaming. "Still here, I see," he remarked, pausing in front of my desk. His voice had that soothing cadence I'd come to know, laced with an authority that made every word seem important. "Just trying to finish up this project proposal. I want to make sure everything's ready for tomorrow's meeting," I replied, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. He nodded approvingly, a rare, slight smile softening his features. "You've done well on this project," he said, surprising me. "I've noticed your commitment, even with late hours like tonight." A flutter of pride mixed with something else, something deeper. It felt surreal to have someone like him recognize my work, let alone praise it. I could feel warmth spreading across my face. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway," I managed, barely containing the surprise in my tone. His eyes lingered on me for a moment, making my pulse quicken. The silence between us stretched, filled with an unspoken weight I couldn't quite identify. He looked around as if noticing for the first time how empty the office was. "There's something about this place after hours, isn't there?" he mused, his gaze distant. "Almost feels like time moves differently." I nodded, understanding the sentiment in a way I couldn't quite express. "It's quieter too. Makes everything seem closer somehow." He raised an eyebrow, a faint glimmer of amusement sparking in his eyes. "Closer. Interesting way to put it," he said, his tone gentle but probing, as if testing the waters. "In a way, you're right. Sometimes the silence makes you notice things you'd usually overlook." The air between us felt charged, his words landing with more weight than I expected. For a moment I wondered if he meant it as an observation about the office, or something more. "Maybe we both need a break from it," he suggested, motioning toward the small kitchenette down the hall. "Join me for a coffee." I hesitated, caught off guard by the offer, but the idea of sharing even a brief moment with him, just the two of us, felt too intriguing to decline. "Sure," I replied, feeling a jolt of excitement. We walked to the kitchenette in silence, and as he prepared the coffee I couldn't help but steal glances at him. There was something captivating about seeing him in this relaxed state, his sleeves rolled up, hands steady and methodical as he measured out the coffee grounds. It was a side of him I'd rarely seen. "It's nice to have company here," he said quietly, catching my gaze just as I turned away, heat creeping up my neck. "Somehow it makes the late hours feel less lonely." I nodded, feeling a strange warmth in his words. "Sometimes it feels like we live half our lives here," I murmured, the thoughts spilling out before I had a chance to stop it. He paused, a look of understanding crossing his face, and the other half waiting for something more. He replied, almost too softly for me to hear. For a moment, the silence was everything. "Do you ever wonder," he began, hesitating just slightly, "if life is more than work?" He was looking at me in a way that made my heart race, his gaze searching, intense, as if waiting for an answer that mattered more than anything. I took a breath, feeling the weight of his question. "I do actually," I said, my voice coming out softer than I'd intended. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to feel more than just accomplishment, something deeper, something real. A faint smile tugged at his lips, almost as if he understood exactly what I meant. His gaze softened, the lines around his eyes relaxing as he studied me. Accomplishment fades, doesn't it? He replied, almost to himself. There comes a time when it doesn't mean as much as connections, real connections. The coffee machine beeped, startling me from the depths of his words. He reached over, his hand brushing against mine as he handed me a cup. The touch was fleeting, accidental, but it sent a shiver through me, like a spark that lingered longer than it should have. "Thank you," I whispered, my fingers gripping the cup to steady myself. He leaned against the counter, taking a slow sip, his gaze never leaving mine. "I don't often allow myself these moments," he admitted, surprising me with the candidness. "You get used to keeping everyone at arm's length. It becomes a habit." I could see the weight of years in his eyes, a lifetime of boundaries that no one had dared cross. And yet, here we were, sharing coffee in the silence of an empty office, words unspoken hanging between us like an invisible thread, pulling us closer. "What about you?" he asked, suddenly, his voice softer. "Do you ever feel like you're waiting for something?" I hesitated, his question hitting closer than I'd expected. "Yes," I admitted, my heart pounding. "Sometimes it feels like I'm just waiting for something to change, something that would make everything feel different, complete maybe." He looked down, nodding as if he knew exactly what I meant. "That's the hard part," he murmured, knowing what's missing but not knowing how to find it. The air felt thick, the unsaid words heavy between us. I could feel his gaze, intense and unyielding, and when I looked up, our eyes met in a way that felt deeper, more searching. It was a look that asked questions I wasn't sure I could answer, a look that felt as though it might undo every line we'd drawn between us. In that moment, I felt a tug, a pull toward him that went beyond reason or caution. I couldn't look away, even as 1,000 thoughts spun through my mind, telling me that this was a line I shouldn't cross, that this was a door that once opened, could never be closed. But then, as if hearing those same thoughts, he took a step back, breaking the gaze and taking a steadying breath. "We should probably get back," he said, his voice regaining its usual composed tone. Yet something lingered in his expression, a flicker of something almost vulnerable. "Yes, of course," I replied, trying to match his professionalism, though my hands shook slightly as I set my cup down. We walked back to our desks, the hallway quiet and dim, the silence between us heavy with what had been left unsaid. When we reached my desk, he paused, turning to look at me once more. "Thank you for the company," he said softly, his voice warm and genuine. "Any time," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He gave me one last lingering glance before turning and disappearing down the hall, leaving me standing there, heart racing and mind spinning with the weight of everything that had just happened and everything that hadn't. For the next few days, I found myself replaying those moments in the kitchenette, his words echoing in my mind. There was something in the way he'd looked at me, something unguarded and sincere that I couldn't forget. It was as though a door had opened between us, one that neither of us had been prepared for. And then, one evening, just as I was about to pack up for the day, I received an email from him. Subject: Project Review Office, after hours. The message was simple, straightforward. He wanted to go over the project proposal I'd submitted, nothing unusual, but his choice to do so after hours seemed deliberate. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen, wondering if he was testing the waters or if I was simply overthinking. I took a breath and replied, agreeing to stay. A few hours later, I was alone in the quiet of the office, waiting. The familiar sounds of the building settling surrounded me, the hum of the fluorescent lights above, the soft hum of the air conditioning. And then I heard his footsteps, steady and measured, as he approached my desk. "Thank you for staying," he said, his voice warm but professional. "Of course," I replied, trying to keep my tone equally composed, though my heart raced with the proximity of him. He took a seat beside me, close enough that I could feel the faint warmth radiating from him. He leaned over, studying the papers I'd laid out on my desk, his hand resting on the edge of the table, just inches from mine. We went over the project, his voice calm and steady as he offered insights and suggestions. I tried to focus on the work, but it was impossible to ignore the quiet tension building between us, each brush of our hands as we turned pages or pointed out details adding to the silent pull I felt toward him. At one point, his hand covered mine as he reached for a paper, and he hesitated, his gaze flicking to mine. Our eyes met, and in that moment, everything else faded: the office, the project, the unspoken rules between us. Neither of us moved, the silence stretching as his hand lingered on mine, warm and grounding. I could feel the weight of his touch, the unspoken questions and hesitations shared between us. "Maybe," "We're not just here for work tonight," he whispered, his voice barely audible, as though he were admitting a forbidden truth. His gaze softened, and the warmth in his eyes was like nothing I'd ever seen before. I felt a shiver run through me, his words hanging in the air like a confession neither of us had expected to hear. My heart pounded, each beat louder than the last, as I held his gaze, feeling a pull so powerful it seemed to erase every reason I had to step back. I don't know what to say," I whispered, my voice catching. I wanted to look away, to pull my hand back, but I couldn't. The intensity of his gaze, the softness in his touch, it was as if we were standing on the edge of something we'd both been circling around for longer than we'd realized. For a moment his expression faltered, as though he was waging a battle within himself. Then, almost imperceptibly, he closed the small distance between us, his hand squeezing mine gently before his thumb brushed across my knuckles. "Neither do I," he murmured, his voice so low it felt like a secret. "But I can't pretend I haven't felt. Something I don't usually allow myself to feel." The honesty in his words unraveled the last thread of composure I'd been clinging to. "I know," I replied, barely recognizing my own voice. "I felt it too." His eyes searched mine, and there was something vulnerable, even raw, in his gaze, like he was finally letting down walls he'd spent a lifetime building. Slowly, as if giving me a chance to pull away, he reached up, his fingers gently brushing my cheek. I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of his hand, and before I could even think to stop myself, I leaned into his touch. The silence between us grew heavy, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of what we both knew but had been too afraid to admit. His thumb traced a gentle line along my cheek, sending a wave of warmth through me that settled somewhere deep, making my pulse quicken. "Maybe we shouldn't," I began, but my words trailed off as his hand moved to the back of my neck, pulling me just a little closer. His face was mere inches from mine now, his breath warm against my skin. My heart raced, each beat echoing in the quiet of the empty office. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his voice thick with hesitation, his gaze locked on mine. I swallowed, my mind racing, knowing that once we crossed this line there would be no going back. But the weight of his hand, the way his eyes lingered on mine, was impossible to ignore. "I don't want you to," I whispered, barely believing the words as they left my mouth. A flicker of relief passed over his face, and in one slow, deliberate movement he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if we were both testing the boundaries of this forbidden territory. But then, as if something shifted within us both, the kiss deepened, growing urgent and intense, each of us pouring into it everything we'd been holding back. I felt his arms wrap around me, pulling me closer, and I leaned into him, the world fading into nothing but the warmth of his embrace, the softness of his lips. My hands moved instinctively, finding their way to his shoulders, feeling the strength beneath the fabric of his shirt. His kisses were filled with a hunger that mirrored my own, a need that had been simmering between us, building in the quiet glances, the lingering touches. Each kiss felt like a confession, each touch a promise. And as we stood there, tangled together in the silence of the office, it felt as though we were the only two people in the world. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine, his breathing unsteady. "This is unexpected," he whispered, his voice laced with something between disbelief and longing. I managed a shaky smile, my hand still resting on his shoulders. "To say the least," I murmured, my heart racing as his thumb traced a gentle line along my jaw. For a moment we simply stood there, our foreheads pressed together, the weight of what had just happened settling over us. But as the seconds passed, I could feel the same pull drawing us closer once more, a pull that neither of us seemed able or willing to resist. Without a word, he took my hand, leading me toward his office. My pulse quickened with each step, the anticipation building, until we were alone in the dimly lit room, the door closing softly behind us. The air was thick with unspoken desire as he turned to face me, his eyes holding a question I didn't need to hear to understand. Slowly he reached for me, his hands gentle as they rested on my hips, pulling me close once more. His lips found mine in another deep, lingering kiss, one that left me breathless, every part of me aware of him in a way that felt new and electrifying. My hands found their way to his face, my fingers tracing the lines I'd only dared admire from afar. I felt him shiver under my touch, his breath hitching as he pulled me even closer, the intensity of his kisses growing with each passing second. The control, the restraint he usually exuded was gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded, something I hadn't known he was capable of showing. Time slipped away as we lost ourselves in each other, the boundaries between us dissolving. His hands moved over me, each touch careful yet full of a longing that felt undeniable, and I found myself responding in kind, every fiber of my being drawn to him, wanting him. Eventually we found ourselves on the couch in his office, tangled together, his hands threading through my hair, his lips trailing along my jaw, my neck, leaving a trail of warmth that made my skin tingle. Each kiss felt like a declaration, each touch a promise we couldn't put into words. For hours we remained entwined, caught in a dance of desire and tenderness that neither of us could deny. And as the night wore on, as the city outside continued its indifferent hum, I found myself sinking deeper into the connection we shared, a connection that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, we pulled apart, our breathing heavy, the weight of what had happened settling over us. His hand lingered on mine, his thumb brushing across my knuckles, his eyes holding a mixture of satisfaction and guilt, of joy and uncertainty. "What do we do now?" I whispered, the question hanging between us like a fragile thread. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness I hadn't expected. "I don't know," he replied softly, his voice tinged with regret. "I don't want this to end, but I don't want it to ruin us either." I nodded, understanding the conflict in his words. We'd crossed a line, one we couldn't simply ignore, yet the consequences loomed like shadows in the early morning light. For a long moment we sat in silence, our hands still intertwined, both of us wrestling with the emotions swirling within us: guilt, desire, confusion, and something else spoken but undeniably real. "Maybe we don't need to figure it all out right now," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Maybe we just take things as they come." He smiled, a soft, bittersweet smile, and gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "Maybe you're right." And as we sat there wrapped in the quiet of the office, our hands still clasped, I knew that whatever happened next, we'd crossed a line that could never be undone. We'd stepped into uncharted territory, and neither of us knew what lay ahead. But for now, in the silence and the warmth of his hand in mine, it felt enough. For the next few days we kept a careful distance, both of us seeming to sense that the line we'd crossed had altered everything. The late-night encounter lingered in my mind, vivid and undeniable, haunting me even as I tried to bury myself in work. I would catch his gaze across the office, a flash of recognition passing between us, a shared memory neither of us could forget, even if we wanted to. But the distance couldn't last. The chemistry we'd uncovered, the quiet understanding that lingered beneath our interactions, kept drawing us together in subtle ways. It was in the way he'd pause outside my office door, or how he'd glance over during meetings, his eyes holding a question neither of us dared ask aloud. One evening, as I was packing up to leave, he appeared at my door. He looked tired, his expression softer than usual, and before I could say anything, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I can't stop thinking about that night," he admitted, his voice a quiet confession. "I know it complicates things, everything, really," but he trailed off, the weight of his words filling the silence. I nodded, feeling a swell of emotions rise within me. "I can't either," I whispered, barely daring to look at him. "But what does it mean?" He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to take mine, his thumb tracing gentle circles over my skin. "I don't know," he replied softly. "I just know that it felt right. Being with you felt like something I didn't even realize I'd been waiting for." A mixture of joy and trepidation surged through me, and I felt my resolve slipping, replaced by the warmth of his touch and the honesty in his eyes. "But what about everything else?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The company, the boundaries we're supposed to keep, your reputation." He sighed, his expression pained. "I've spent a lifetime building walls, keeping people at a distance. I thought it was necessary, that it was the only way to keep things from getting complicated. But with you, I can't ignore it. I don't want to." The words hung between us, a quiet declaration that felt at once liberating and terrifying. Without another thought, he closed the space between us, his hand gently brushing my cheek as he leaned down, his lips meeting mine in a soft, lingering kiss. It was a kiss filled with all the things we couldn't say, all the unspoken promises and uncertainties. As we broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, a small, bittersweet smile playing on his lips. "I don't have all the answers," he whispered, his voice filled with vulnerability, "but I don't want to walk away from this." I felt my heart swell, a mixture of fear and excitement rushing through me. "Neither do I replied, my voice barely a breath. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments and stolen glances, the tension between us both thrilling and unnerving. We navigated the boundaries cautiously, careful not to draw too much attention, yet unable to stay away from each other. Every interaction, every shared glance, felt charged with meaning, a reminder of what lay beneath the surface. But as time went on, I could feel a shadow of doubt creeping in. an awareness of the complications that lingered just beneath the surface. We'd created something beautiful and fragile, but the reality of our positions of what was expected of him, of me, loomed over us like a storm we couldn't ignore. One evening, as we shared yet another quiet moment in his office, he took my hand, his expression serious. "This, what we found together, it means so much to me, but I don't want it to cost you anything. You have a future here, a career you've worked hard to build." I squeezed his hand, feeling a pang of sadness at the resignation in his voice. "Don't say that. This, whatever it is, it's worth the risk to me." He looked down, his thumb tracing gentle circles on my hand. "I care about you too much to let you take that risk," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "I can't let what we have become something that hurts you." A lump formed in my throat as I looked at him, seeing the depth of his feelings in the sadness that filled his eyes. "So, what does that mean for us?" I asked, my voice shaking. He took a deep breath, his hand lingering on mine for a moment longer before he let go, his gaze full of regret. Maybe this is where it has to end," he said softly. "As much as I want to hold on to this, I can't risk the future you deserve." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, a hollow ache spreading through me as his words sank in. "I don't want it to end like this," I whispered, feeling the weight of goodbye settle over me. Neither of us moved for a long moment, both of us caught in the painful realization that we were letting go of something we'd only just found. But eventually he took a step back, his expression a mixture of sorrow and acceptance. "I'll never forget this," he said, his voice barely audible. "And I'll always be grateful that we found each other, even if just for a little while." I managed a tearful smile, my heart breaking, even as I nodded. "Me too." And as I left his office, a quiet ache filling the space between us, I knew that we'd both been changed by what we'd found. We'd shared something real, something that had broken down walls and reminded us both of the beauty of connection, even if it had to end too soon.